Hello, today we're going to have a look at DBGp proxies, which provide a way of connecting a development server to a local network by the means of this proxy. For Xdebug's debugger, Xdebug running on PHP needs to be able to connect to your IDE. If these are on the same network, this is not a problem, because they can connect to localhost. If your development machine is located on the same network as your local machine, this is also not a problem because you can configure Xdebug to use its client host setting to make a connection to your IDE on your local machine. If you're with multiple developers, you can then use Xdebug's discover client host setting to also be able to do that. Now, if your development machine is located on a different network, different from your local machine, for example, in a cloud service, then in most cases Xdebug cannot make a connection direct through your local machine because they are often hiding behind NAT. In these situations, you can use Xdebug's DBGp Proxy to then forward connections. This proxy you need to install on the outside node of your network, often on your firewall, so that outside connections from your outside development machine can make a connection to this node directly. The proxy then can make sure to forward all the incoming connections to your local machines, depending on which IDE key has been set, so that the proxy can forward the information to the right local machine for the right developer. The way how the proxy knows how to do that is because IDEs need to register themselves with this proxy server with an IDE key. The way how this works is when you start your IDE to put it in listen for Xdebug connections mode, it will connect to the proxy server, register its IDE key, and then disconnect. But the proxy now knows that to associate this IDE key with the IP address and a port number of where the IDE will listen to. When you then initiate a debugging request through your browser with a debugging extension which also has the same IDE key set, that it then connects to the proxy, and then the proxy can forward it depending on the IDE key to your local machine. Now let's see how we can set this up. First of all, we're going to have to change our development machine's configuration to set up which IP address to connect to. To find out what our INI file is, we can type php-ini. This tells me that our configuration file is this one. I will open this up as root user to make our configuration. At the moment, I've only have Xdebug loaded, which doesn't put it in debug mode, nor does it have the IP address configured of the proxy to connect to. So let me add that. Technically, it is not necessary to use develop mode as well, but I always like those on to get my nice stack traces in orange colors. The debug mode is important because that enables the step debugger. The second thing to then configure is the IP address where the proxy runs at. And you do that by setting xdebug.clienthost. In my case, that's the following address. I can now save this file and start our web server. I'm using PHP's built-in web server here, but that shouldn't matter whatsoever. Now PHP should be configured to connect to the debugging proxy whenever a debug connection starts. Now the second thing to do is to set up our proxy. Gargle Blaster is my firewall, and on the firewall I'm going to start the DBGp proxy. By default it will only listen on localhost, which doesn't really work, of course, if you want to connect from different machines. So I will set it up in such a way that it will listen to all incoming connections. Port 9001 is the DBG proxy where IDEs register their IDE keys. And port 9003 is Xdebug's normal port. I will now press enter to start the proxy. The third thing to do is to make our configuration in our editor. I will be using VS Code to register itself with this proxy server. This is my already existing configuration, the listen for Xdebug one. I have enabled stop on entry, which means that the IDE will stop at the first line of my script. This is a great way of debugging whether the debugger actually works. The first thing that we need to do is to set up path mappings, to map the paths that our development server has to the paths in which our local source code lives. Remotely on our development server, my code lives in the following path. And locally where my IDE runs in this path. Now we have the path mapping set up, we need to set up our proxy. For that we use the proxy key. First we need to enable it. Then we need to set the host, which is not localhost. We have to use the IP address here that allows a machine on the local network can talk to the proxy running on the same network. And then we also need to set up our IDE key. I will use code-Derek. And that should be all the configurations. Now I can open the debug panel and click the Start Debugging button. When I do that, VS Code should register itself with the proxy. And as you can see, it has successfully done so. You can also confirm this in the window where the proxy runs. This entry shows that. Now the last configuration that we need to make is in our browser. I am debugging the Xdebug website here. In order to make this work, I've installed a browser extension called Xdebug Helper, which is available for Firefox, Chrome, as well as other browsers. I can click on the icon and then click on Settings. By default, the IDE key that it has configured is Xdebug Eclipse, but we need to change that to our own IDE key. This IDE key needs to be unique for every user so that the proxy knows where to forward the debugging requests to. I click Save and then close the tab. When I now go to my icon and enable the debugger, nothing will happen, but the moment I click on a link, Xdebug should connect to the proxy because that is the IP address that we have configured with Xdebug's client host setting. VS Code instantly pops up on the first line of the script, which is what we expect because we're using a router. Let me now step through this. As you can see, debugging works like normal. If I'm done debugging, I can now click the Stop button so that VS Code deregisters itself with the proxy service. You get a confirmation in the debug console as well. When I now click on a different link, Xdebug will still want to connect to the proxy to ask it to forward the debugging requests. So when I click this, for example, it doesn't actually stop in the IDE, of course, because the IDE has been deregistered from the proxy. On the command line, you also see that in the log. In this case, you get a bunch of warnings as well. To recap, we had to do 4 different things to make this work. First was to configure Xdebug on the development server to set client host to the IP address of the proxy and enable the debugger. Then I had to start the proxy itself on our firewall, which I did with the DBGp Proxy command. Thirdly, I had to instruct VS Code to connect to the proxy server by setting up the proxy key. And lastly, I had to configure my chosen IDE key in my browser extension so that the proxy knows where to forward my debugging requests to. The DBGp proxy only really works when you can install it on the firewall, which has an outside connectable IP address. If you cannot install DBGp proxy on your firewall, then there is an alternative solution, which is called Xdebug Cloud, a cloud-hosted service of something that does the same thing. But in this case, both the IDE and Xdebug connect to the cloud server, running on a public IP address, circumventing the necessity of Xdebug having to connect directly to your IDE. If you want to try that out, you can go to xdebug.cloud. If you enjoyed this video, please click like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.